All right, boys and girls, welcome back to history class. Since American history in high school is not doing a very good job at teaching us our actual American history, I'm here to do so. There was a lot of interest on my last video wanting me to go more in depth about the West Virginia coal mines, and I would love to do so. Specifically, I asked about the Battle of Blair Mountain, but if we're going to talk about Blair Mountain, we have to talk about a few other things first. Now, I'm going to start this with saying that I'm not an expert in this situation. I am just a normal person who is interested in this. I do know a decent amount about it. I maybe don't know every little detail correctly, so I'm probably going to get a few things wrong, and this is probably going to be a few parts because there's a lot of details and it's really long and it's really interesting. So just get you a snack and we're just going to get through it, okay? It's going to be fun. We're going to learn something today. Specifically, I asked about the Battle of Blair Mountain, but if we're going to talk about Blair Mountain, there's a few other incidents we got to talk about beforehand. If you don't know what the Battle of Blair Mountain is, in short, it was a battle between the miners that were working in coal mines in West Virginia. These miners were going up against a group of Union busters known as the Baldwin-Felts Agency. The Baldwin-Felts Agency, for all intents and purposes, was basically a private police service, and they were hired by these mine companies to squash this Union talk. The Battle of Blair Mountain was in August of 1921, but to understand this, we're going to back up about 10 years and we're going to go back to 1912. In the late 1890s, a group formed called the United Mine Workers of America. They're going to be extremely important to this story. United Mine Workers was a trade union that was focused on the coal miners in the late 1800s, I believe 1890. It was actually founded in Columbus, Ohio, and a lot of mine workers obviously wanted to unionize, and a lot of these coal companies obviously didn't want them to unionize because they didn't want to pay them anything. And nothing would get you fired faster from your job as a coal miner, faster than showing any kind of support for a union, any desire to join a union. The way that these companies would kick you out of your house and evict you out of these company towns and everything was through these private agencies like the Baldwin-Felts Agency. To start our story, we're going to start in 1912. We are on the verge of going to World War I. We're going to go to Kanawha County, West Virginia. This is where the state capital of West Virginia is, which is Charleston. This is also where the Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strikes began. In Kanawha County, there were 96 total mines. About half of these mines, around 40 of them, were unionized, and the other 55 or so along Cabin Creek were not. It's important to note here that the Paint Creek miners were also making less money than other union miners in other coal mines in the same state and in the same area. Because of this, the Paint Creek Union tried to negotiate with the owners of these coal companies to increase their pay, which would have come out to about 15 cents per miner per day. Naturally, the coal company was not fucking having that. They were absolutely not going to do that, so the workers went on strike. They had a list of demands, and I'm actually going to read these to you because this is basically what they were all asking for anytime they went on strike. That the operators accept and recognize the union, that the miners' right to free speech and peaceable assembly be restored, that the blacklisting discharged workers would be stopped, compulsory trading at the company's stores would be ending, meaning that they would no longer pay for goods in script, that they would actually pay for them with the actual US dollar that they were being paid. Coal cribbing would be discontinued, and that they would install scales at these mines because these miners were paid by the ton. So they were paid by ton of coal that came out. A ton is 2,000 pounds. They weren't weighing these. They weren't weighing these tons. They were putting them in these coal crib things that were supposed to hold 2,000 pounds or a ton, but they were absolutely holding more than that. So these guys were working even harder for less money and more product for the company. Because if you haven't figured this out yet, these coal companies were going to screw over these men in any possible way. Like I said, the coal companies weren't fucking having this. After Paint Creek went on strike, they were able to convince the workers at the Cabin Creek mines on the other side of the creek to join in and go on strike on their own. They obviously couldn't join the union strike because they weren't union. However, they did go on strike against their own company. This went on for about a month or so because in the middle of May, these companies had had enough of this shit and they were losing a lot of money. So they hired the Baldwin-Felts Agency. Basically, these guys were professional strike breakers and private police and just general nuisance to anybody outside of the owners of these coal mines. The Baldwin-Felts Agency sent 300 strike breakers to the Cabin Creek, Paint Creek area to break up this strike. And then about a month later in June, we have another person show up named Mother Jones. We're going to get into Mother Jones a little bit more. She's a huge character in this. Just know she was a very old lady who was an absolute pain in the ass to a lot of people and got shit done. Now, there are mixed opinions on this woman, but for the purpose of this story, she was brought in to help these union workers defeat these coal companies. Mother Jones, whose name was Mary Jones, that in her later life, and I'm talking in her 80s, became an activist for labor rights, not only for coal mines, but for children and factories and things like that. And she traveled around the country helping organize these unions and fight for what they wanted. Now, we could go into Mother Jones for like a series of 5 videos, so I'm not going to do that. But just know she's around. She's an old lady, but she is taking no one's shit, and she is not afraid to be around these men. In June, the coal companies and the Baldwin-Felts Agency began evicting these miners from their company-owned houses. They also brought in replacement workers who were desperate enough for money that they were willing to go through the picket line and work in these mines. And this isn't just a casual, hey, you got to get out. No, these are violent evictions. There were snipers involved. There are so many people that lost their lives in this. There were beatings, mutilations, things like that to prove points from both sides, mostly the Baldwin-Felts Agency at this point. However, it absolutely went both ways. In July, after this strike had been going on for 3 months, Mother Jones, who is still there in West Virginia, helps organize a march on the Capitol building. These miners wrote out a declaration of war and intended to read this declaration of war to then Governor William Glasscock on the Capitol steps. On July 26th in Mucklow, West Virginia, which is present-day Gallagher, West Virginia, there was a little bit of a skirmish situation between the strikers and these guards that left about 12 of the strikers dead and 4 guards. While evicted from their home, these miners are living in basically tent cities with their families. And later on, when we get into Blair Mountain, we'll talk about what was happening in some of these tent cities. There were women, children, newborns, pregnant women, sick people. There were also both white and black people in these cities, as well as first and second generation immigrants that have been coming over to America in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when immigration was kind of at its height and encouraged. There were a lot of Irish immigrants and a lot of Italian immigrants, a lot of Scottish immigrants, Greek immigrants. These were people that, while they didn't face the same amount of racism as a black person would, they absolutely were met with racism, prejudice, and that sort of thing. At this time, for some reason, being Irish or Italian, they were also treated really, really terribly by the people in this country. Imagine that we treat anybody that isn't white and look like us terrible. So they're living in this large tent city. Mind you, there's several thousand people here. There are a few thousand miners and their entire families that are living in these tent cities. And on September 1st, 5,000 more miners came to join the strikers in their efforts. Once these 5,000 additional miners arrived in Kanawha County, Governor Glasscock enacted martial law the next day. There were 1,200 state troopers that were sent into this, and I don't remember if this one or Blair Mountain is what created the West Virginia State Police, but one of those two strikes created it. These 1,200 state troops were coming in and they were confiscating ammunition, guns, things like that from both sides of this conflict, which did kind of calm things down just a little bit because obviously tensions were very high. However, due to the martial law, they were forbidden to congregate together. These miners were forbidden to be in groups. How are you going to do that? They live in a tent city. They're always in a damn group. And unfortunately, if they were arrested under this martial law, they were subject to very fast and unfair trials about this. At this point, winter in West Virginia, which it can be notoriously harsh, had set in, and these families were living in these tents on the side of hills with some of them not having anything between them and the ground. If they were lucky, they maybe had an oilcloth or something like that that they could lay down. They were literally living on frozen ground under tarps. There was another march that the women actually did during this. It was an umbrella march. It was organized by Mother Jones and a woman named Sarah Blizzard, who was the mother of somebody who's going to come up later named Bill Blizzard. They organized an umbrella march where the pro-union women would actually march holding umbrellas through the valley where they were living. This was to bring attention to the fact that they were all freezing to death, starving to death. They were sick. They had no medicine. They had no money. They had no nothing. And these men and their conflict was now affecting the women and children and the future generations and therefore future workers that were going to remain in this state. This went on all the way through the beginning of 1913. And martial law was declared a couple more times and it was lifted. And then right before the governor left office, he lifted it for the final time. On February 7th, these miners did attack Mucklow again, the town of Mucklow, which is now Gallagher, West Virginia. They'd already attacked it once. They did do it again, and one miner was killed at least. In retaliation for this, the sheriff, whose name was Bonner Hill, he attacked this tent city, mind you, full of women and children and the striking miners and old people, and their entire extended families are living in this tent city, which is called Holly Grove, by the way. He decided that he was going to attack this tent city using an armored train. An armored train. He called it the Bull Moose Special, which honestly is kind of a badass name. If you want to get like perfectly honest about it, that's kind of badass. This train was armed with machine guns and high-powered rifles. He was not fucking around. The tent city, being on the side of a mountain, obviously had a railroad track running at the bottom of it. What he was able to do was to take this armored train by this city and fire into the tent city to make his point. One miner was inside of his little tent city house and over 100 bullets were fired into his tent alone. I believe he had some kind of makeshift house, but it was fired into his little home dwelling alone, and of course that killed him. Now Sarah Blizzard, the woman we talked about earlier who led a protest march with Mother Jones, the mother of Bill Blizzard, she decided to lead a group of women and do what women do in situations like this, and we're not going to panic and we're going to fix it. She went down and damaged the railroad track. These women went down and fucked up a railroad track so that no other trains could come through here and do this again, and to prevent a second attack or a second wave of this attack, which, by the way, was being staged. There were a couple more attacks in the days that followed. A couple more people died before martial law was declared for the final time. February 13th of 1913, Mother Jones was arrested for inciting a riot in Kanawha County. Allegedly, she was trying to read the Declaration of Independence at some kind of gathering or some kind of strike meeting. She was also later charged with conspiracy to commit murder once she was in jail. Because it was under martial law, this was in military court. This was not in the state of West Virginia court. This was being held in military court, where Mother Jones refused to acknowledge their jurisdiction. Mind you, she's like 83 years old at this point. Mother Jones, she refuses to enter a plea, and she's sent to prison. She gets 20 years in prison, so naturally a life sentence for her since she's already in her 80s. While she was in prison, she did acquire a pretty nasty case of pneumonia. On March 4th, West Virginia has a new governor. New governor, Dr. Henry Hatfield, the nephew of the famous Devil Anse Hatfield, was sworn in as the governor of West Virginia, and the first thing he did was travel to this area to see what the problem was. When he arrived there, he released about 30 people that were being held under this martial law in custody in Kanawha County. He also transferred Mother Jones to a hospital in Charleston because, like I said, she acquired a pretty nasty case of pneumonia and was not in great shape. In April, the new governor decided that he was going to put an end to this strike and he was going to establish the conditions to end this strike. This was called the Hatfield contract. We can go over what all it covered, but honestly, those details aren't relevant for the short version of this story. This is so far from the fucking short version of this story, but you get the point. The Paint Creek miners, who were already unionized, they accepted the Hatfield contract in May. The Cabin Creek miners, the ones who were not unionized, on the other hand, they resisted it and they continued fighting it with some violence in a few cases until later that summer. After mostly recovering from her pneumonia, Mother Jones was being held on house arrest at a boarding house back in Pratt, West Virginia. But despite being on house arrest, she was able to smuggle a message out to a union sympathizer, something to that effect, who was a representative from the state of Indiana. But after 85 days of imprisonment, counting the time that she was in prison, the hospital, and on house arrest, Governor Hatfield released her from custody and dropped the charges against her and did not comment about it. Now, later in May of 1913, this senator from Indiana, John Kern, he wrote something called the Kern Resolution. This led to the Senate's Committee on Education and Labor opening investigation into the conditions in the West Virginia coal mines. This one in particular is just about West Virginia, but these mining practices are happening all over the country. During these Senate hearings about this, they have someone come in there and they're trying to estimate the number of deaths so far that have come from these strikes, to which one source says there were, quote, perhaps 50 violent deaths. Y'all had an armored train fired on a tent city that had 8,000 workers and their families in it. I'm going to go out on a limb and say there's more than 50 violent deaths. Following the strike at the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek mines, we have possibly the most pivotal thing that has happened in the state of West Virginia in a really long time. We have to talk about Matewan. And if we're going to talk about Matewan's going to get its own video. So you can head over to the next one. I'm going to post it right after I post this one. I will see you there.